I did my best. Unfortunately, I didn't have a lot of help and I didn't know what I was doing, and I ran myself into the ground trying to take care of my daughter. When she was about 7 months old, um, I hadn't eaten, I hadn't slept. Um, I had my sister arrive and see that I wasn't coping. She took my daughter and said that she would take her for a few days and let me get my strength back. She proceeded to bring me a whole heap of food. So I was sitting on my kitchen floor eating when there was a knock at my door. Next thing I knew, I was in handcuffs and being taken to the mental ward.
And then one of the ladies said, we can do this two ways. We can either work with you voluntary for 90 days or we can take you to court. So, of course, we agreed to do the voluntary for 90 days. And they said, yep, we'll come out and see you on Thursday. So we made that appointment. And then I went home that night. Everything was good. The next day, everything was good. And then 6 o'clock, and then my partner had said they'd organised a meeting to see him that night. So I was like, okay. And then I was at home feeding the baby. And then there was a knock on the door and 2 police were there and said, there's someone here to see you. And then there was 2 child protection workers there. So I started crying. I said, what are you doing? What are you doing? And they just kept yelling, we've got new information, let us in. So I'm crying, what are you doing? I just had a baby. Like, what's going on? We've got new information. So I said to them, well, why didn't you ring me today? Like, I would have come in today. So they just pushed their way in and waved a piece of paper at me saying, we're putting your baby in foster care. You need to hand her over.
And then the department placed me in Kew Cottages. They asked me to stay there for the duration of the pregnancy. So I stayed there for the duration of the pregnancy. They told me nothing about what was going to happen. And they actually induced the baby so they could take the baby from birth. So I went into the hospital thinking that I was going to go in, get inducted, go home and have a home to go to with support, and I was going to have the baby with me. But this did not happen.
My first experience of child protection was shortly after the kid's dad was locked up, like within a few days. They came around and interviewed me. They seemed to feel like everything was fine. They had requested that I do drug screens. They did give some conditions, talked about what their concerns were, and I felt like I had a good idea of why they were knocking on the door. So subsequent to that, I was homeless. I was couch surfing. I didn't do any drug screens. And within a very short time, they came knocking back at the door to remove the children.
I was doing everything that I could do to regain my strength so that I could have my daughter back. As far as I knew, reunification was on the table. But then about 6 weeks into it, DHS arrived and came and told me that I'm going to court tomorrow and that they were going to be handing her over to my sister. I had no notice. I had no clothes. I was unprepared and I had to get myself to court first thing the next morning without any time to plan or prepare.
So we had to go in the office and we had to sit there to wait for a magistrate to come out to do an out-of-court session to actually hand custody of my baby back over to me. So I was there from, say, about 7:30 at night till 2 o'clock in the morning. So the magistrate came over. Like, by this time, like, I've just had a baby. Like, I'm trying to feed. I'm trying to do all sorts of things. They're handing me a chocolate bar to eat, and I'm like, I'm feeding. Like, so, and then the magistrate just signed a paperwork and said, there you go. And then the workers handed me another piece of paper and said, you have to be at court tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the morning.
When I had the child, the police and child protection were at the birth with an apprehension order ready to take the baby from birth. So my experience was giving birth, having the cord cut, and then the baby being taken into the special care nursery and removed then and there. The very next day, after giving birth, I was then in court. So I had this blue sheet of paper. My baby was in the nursery. I couldn't see my baby. I wasn't allowed to see the baby. The hospital wasn't allowed to allow me to see the baby. All I had was a piece of blue paper. I was left in a room by myself. I was extremely upset. I was extremely devastated. My whole world had just been torn off me.
The children were removed in the afternoon and, yeah, driven away by the child protection people. And I was advised that I'd need to be at court the following day in the morning. The child protection worker that was at the court sort of, look, I guess explained to me in a way that probably caused me to be more compliant than I necessarily would have been if I'd had all of the accurate information, or if I'd been even given the time to process what kind of information I would need. Because I really went into that court hearing with the understanding that if I agreed to the order that they were making, which was an interim or accommodation order to my mum's care, that I would be able to address those concerns and have the children returned to me quite quickly, you know, within a couple of weeks. So, you know, I sort of, look, it felt bad and big, but it didn't feel as big and bad as to be unmanageable. And I really had that impression that, okay, if I go along with this, if I do all the right things, I'll do what they want me to do, and then my children will be coming home.
So I was given no notice to go into court. I was not being allowed out of the unit for more than a couple of hours at a time, on very short occasions. But then when I was given the court papers, I was expected to get up first thing and get to the city on my own. Luckily enough, my aunt came with me and held my hand through the whole process. Otherwise, I would have been completely alone.
So a friend had to come and get me. She lived 2 hours away, so I had to drive all the way home for 2 hours. That friend didn't have anything for me as a person that's just given birth, so I'm still sitting in the same clothes and same everything from that night. And then we had to drive another 2.5 hours to get to the court the next morning by 10 o'clock. We were told I wasn't allowed to speak to my partner, anything, otherwise I'll take my baby and put her in foster care again.
So I remember getting to court and seeing her father when we got there. He had his own lawyer, I had my own lawyer. I went into a room, we were only in there for 20 minutes, and I was basically told just to go along with everything to get her into her father's care. which is what I wanted ultimately, for her to be a part of his care. Unfortunately, I wasn't aware that reunification was not going to be on the table after that.
We got there at 9, 10 o'clock and just going in and out of court all day in like 36-degree heat, sitting in the hot windows, just people everywhere. I kept falling asleep because I'm just tired. I couldn't feed my baby because milk, my milk hadn't come in yet. And then the last court hearing, the court had closed and we were still there at 5 o'clock. And then the magistrate said, "What are you doing? There's no evidence here," and sent us home together.
So I was in court the next day. The father couldn't stay in court because he kept on going off and getting drunk because he couldn't handle what was going on or whatever his excuse was. So I had to sit in there and listen, and I had to talk to the legal team. I'd asked to represent myself only, the judge at that time, because I'd been in and out of the court since I was 11 years old because of my own child protection involvement. I was no stranger to the children's court, so the judges were quite familiar with who I was. So because of that, they said, "Well, look, no, we're not going to allow you to represent yourself." So I had to get a duty lawyer.
The first experience of court for me with child protection, to be honest, was a blur. I think at that stage, as a parent with your children just removed from your care, you're so overwhelmed. There's a real grief in that process. And even if you'd had longer than, let's say, less than overnight, which is what I had, it's such an unknown. Particularly if you've had no experience of that child protection system before, there's just really no way that between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 9 a.m. the following morning, you can equip yourself with the information that you need to actually be an included decision maker in that space. And I think it's pretty clear at that point that decisions aren't designed to have you in mind or to accommodate you or include you in any way. You are not an active participant in this process. It is something that's happening to you because you're a terrible parent.
I was gaining my strength in the hospital. I was eating, I was sleeping, I was taking my medication. I was doing everything that I could possibly do, jumping through all of the hoops so that I would be able to be reunited with my daughter. Unfortunately, I wasn't aware that that wasn't the case and that DHS were going to hand her to my sister, and that would be that.
So with all of the court cases, I don't think I had any support, knowledge or anything of what was going on, because most, like 9 times out of 10, child protection would hand that paperwork over either 5 o'clock the night before and then you couldn't get hold of them again, or they'd literally hand it to you as you're about to walk into the courtroom. So yeah, I didn't have time to prepare and things like that. And like even the first court time ever, like I've just given birth and they give you a free lawyer, you think you're going to be good. You literally get 2 minutes in a room with them and they just ask your name, address, really just, you don't get any time to speak about anything. And as I said, the lawyer just said to me, it's just easier if you just agree with everything and then you can get out of here a lot quicker. Like, so that's not supporting me. So yeah, I just feel like I didn't have the help. Like someone that doesn't know the first thing about courts, I think I was just thrown in the deep end and there was just no one there to help me.
When I first went to court, I only had the piece of blue paper that the police gave me. So I didn't really have the amount of information I needed. Another thing is I didn't have anybody there. There was no family member there. The husband was out the front drunk and I was stuck in there to deal with everything. It would have been helpful to have somebody there. Because having no one, that's a really lonely, dark place to be in. It's a really hard, dark time. And it's a really difficult thing to have to navigate. And have been there all alone is just a really terrible experience to have to go through.
Look, I think for me, it is abundantly clear. Like when you think of court, you don't immediately think of child protection. You think of crime and punishment. It's supposed to be a justice system, not a parenting support system. So I guess in terms of that, court is actually designed by the look of it, the feel of it, and the professionals in it, that the person actually fronting to answer to the court does not have the same weight given to their experience or their voice or their desires as any of the professionals in the courtroom. And guess what? Everybody except you in the matter about you and your family is a professional. So in a lot of ways, that system is, look, it has a built-in power imbalance that I think will probably be really hard to overcome without, I guess, a real change in that fundamental way of how we view parents and how we view early intervention and how we view support for parents that are having a tough time, and whether court is the most appropriate space for that.
Things moved on. We were co-parenting for about a year. Then DHS, their involvement ended, and within 2 weeks, I had gone to drop her off at his house, and he'd had an overdose. I couldn't prove anything at the time. I had to leave her. So the first thing I did was get onto DHS. My family and I, with the support of my family, we got onto DHS. Unfortunately, what we had to say meant nothing. They thought it was a custody battle.
And then it got to the point where we had to go back to court so child protection could close because there was nothing going on, no evidence or anything. So we went back to court and then everything was closed. And as we're at the front of the courtroom, one of the workers came up to me and the father shook our hands and said, you know, congratulations, like all the best for your future. But I'm just letting you know that if child protection do get involved again, they will be taking your child from you.
I wasn't going to agree and the department wasn't going to agree. And so there was no other option but for it to go to a contested mention. There was doctors, there was different professionals who all got up and said that they thought that the children were better off not with me. The other thing about the way that people come to their conclusion, if a department orders a report, often the people who are ordered to do the assessment through the department side with the department as opposed to giving a fair go with the family. I think sometimes that's where independent reports are probably more useful to get a fair result. But in my case, it didn't happen for those 3 children.
There was a process involved, so the kids were coming back to me. It did still take a further 6 months of staggered visits and things like that. But beyond that, there was very, very little child protection intervention or assistance. You know, I'd had my parenting payments cut off, so I was on Job Seeker. I approached the department when the children were coming to me for 3 nights a week. Would they be able to help with food or supplies or anything like that? No, you're on your own. We're done. Our job here is done. You're getting your children back. You sort it out. So I think post-court, there's a real lack of support for parents as well, given that, you know, for a lot of parents, I had been without my children, you know, staying in my care for over a year. And some of that, I think, includes relearning parenting and acknowledging that in order not to fail, that parents probably need a little bit of more support wrapped in once court has happened. And that would apply whether or not your children were returned, in fact, that support would be required.
Around a year later, he was then found in a car, needles in the car, blood all over the car, my daughter in the back seat, screaming. He'd had an overdose again. The police had found him this time, and they then proceeded to remove her out of his care. She then was taken to my sister while DHS checked me out, my credentials, and made sure that I was capable of actually taking care of my child.
So when that worker said, we'll take your children off you if child protection get involved again, that stuck with me. So then later on, my partner did become violent and horrendous things were happening to me, which I felt I could not go to the police or I couldn't go to child protection because they would take by then it was children off me, even though I wasn't doing anything wrong. It's just those last words that he said to me, they'll take them off me. So for years, I put up with the physical abuse because I was too scared to get help. And all my friends would say, you've got to go to the police, you've got to do this. And I just kept saying, you don't understand, they'll take my children. And they kept saying, but you're a good mum. And I'm like, they don't care, they're going to take my babies off me. So I lived with that abuse for years and years until it all came to an end.
After giving birth to my first child, Amy, I wasn't given any information. I wasn't told any of my rights. I didn't even think I had rights. I thought that was it, and basically everything was over. It wasn't until I went to court until I was like, well, I kind of have rights, because the judge actually ordered for the department to hire a nurse to sit in with me 24 hours a day until they'd organised accommodation. But this wasn't a long-term option either. This was only a temporary option. So this went on for 3 weeks until the contested mention was booked in.
It was only very late in the piece when Child Protection, I guess, reversed that decision to apply for the permanent care order, that they actually could see, or actually acknowledged for the first time, that I was doing all the things, that I did have insight, that I was committed to actually having my children back in my care, that I actually felt like I even had, an opportunity to present my side of the story in court. Until that case plan changed and the department were actually, on my side as opposed to actively working against me, the court process was not inclusive of me. It was not about me. And even then, when we went back to court, when the case plan was to return the children to me, I think that hearing lasted maybe 5 minutes. It was very quick. Once the department had actually said, yes, well, we're on board with returning the children to the mother's care under a reunification order, that was it. The judge agreed and out everybody went.
Once DHS realised that there was an issue with him and that I was probably the parent that would be better for my child, things changed. I was then aware of what was going on. I was told, we want her to go back to you. The judges rarely go against what DHS wants, and that my daughter would be back in my care.
So I had different workers from the start, and it just wasn't working well. Wasn't getting along with those workers, and things weren't going good in courts and things like that. So the deputy area manager became involved, and she was then my worker. Had this big conversation, and from then she said, that's when it clicked that I've got this, I know what I'm doing, and things just changed. So she involved me with all decisions, any information she got, she would let me know, she would send me reports, everything that was going on behind the scenes, I was involved in.
So after my fourth child was born, there was a meeting that was conducted at the hospital, and there was 17 professionals in the room, and they all had nothing but positive things to say in regards to myself. So therefore, I got the fair opportunity to be able to parent my daughter from birth.
Look, what it looked like and felt like in terms of child protection, sort of changing that case plan to agree to reunification, it was very validating. And I'd like to say that that happened because they were communicative with me and open with me. It actually was a battle all the way through, and I had significant other professional people, I guess, going in and stepping into bat for me. I'm not sure if I would have had the strength to do that by myself.
Throughout the entire court process, I don't think I really understood completely what was going on or what my options were. I didn't realise that I had options. In the beginning, obviously, I had no idea what was going on. I was sent to court so quickly. I wasn't given the information that I needed, and as the process went on, I did start to understand a little bit more, but I still don't feel like I ever grasped it properly. When DHS were on my side and they wanted my daughter back in my care, they did offer me more information, and I feel like I had a little bit more of an option.
My involvement with child protection just felt so dismissive, so disrespectful, so, I don't know, there was no regard for me in that process because I was not a professional. And I consequently am now halfway through a master's degree and working as a professional in that field because I really wanted to make sure and lock it in that that would never happen to me again. So it actually has changed every single day of my whole life and will for the foreseeable future, and that of my children, because I'm not ever going to be that person in the room that doesn't get listened to ever again. And that is a direct outcome of feeling that way for a good 18 months while I was treated like that by the system.
In an ideal world, I would have preferred to have the option to go into the mother baby unit with my daughter, prove myself, and have the bond complete that we needed, without it being broken. That time in her life where she was growing was so important for us to be there with each other, and we still have issues now.
When they got involved another time after the family violence, I didn't know, but they'd reopened and they were investigating things. So they had evidence, they had photos because someone had gone to the police. So they did have evidence, but they still didn't ring me and ask me if I needed help. So for 3 months, they just did all their investigating behind the scenes until it actually did come to a head and he was arrested. And she asked me like months later if I said to her, I said, well, why didn't you ring me? Like, I needed help. I needed to get out. And she said to me, because I didn't think you'd take it. And she said, would you have? I said, 100%. I needed help to get out of that situation. And you don't know unless you ask the question. So she said to me, she has to live with that now for the rest of her life, that she just didn't ask that question.
Often in these circumstances, I find professionals want to do what's easiest as opposed to what's best. So sometimes the best thing isn't always the easiest thing, but in the long term, it's the best solution. So I think that's something that I took away from the court space.
So I do understand. I guess some of those things that can contribute to parents feeling disregarded. I am also aware that, child protection workers are human. They do not get up every day and think, oh, let's go and take somebody's child away and completely ruin their family. I guess the stress and burnout level of having to deal with that day after day after day would probably impact you really negatively as a worker in that space. But I think, again, you know, that comes down to resourcing. And even as a family services worker myself, I see the constraints that resources or lack of resources create. And guess what? That's actually not the family's problem. That's the department's problem. And we really need to stop blaming families who also are not really resourced or supported for all of those things, for the failings of a system that is not servicing their needs.